And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
Welcome to Music 101. Music 101 is created to empower music itself and legendary icon in the music industry. And another week, another great episode on Music 101. What are the music screen shakers, rock and roll, and rock films and soundtracks? Wow, that's amazing topic today, Mr.
I,
Mac.
I think so too. So, I want to try to introduce those screen shakers. Let's talk a little bit about them, because there's been a number of films that featured early rockers and later artists who exploded on the screen to tantalize fans. There are a number of rock and roll soundtracks that helped break the genre into the mainstream. Later on, as rock developed, other artists defined their appeal not only musically, but visually as well. You discover music is really helpful on these things, and I got help to get a handle on the films. I want to credit them for doing some first-rate work and credit them for some of their research as well. For the early rockers, from Jailhouse Rock to The Girl Can't Help It, these soundtracks defined an era and introduced a larger audience to the power of music. And so for a lot of those folks, that really broke them into the mainstream, so they didn't have to go to a rock and roll concert or a dance, but there they were up on the silver screen. And the 50s were a boom decade for rock and roll movies, many of which were built around the tales of teenagers, which were, of course, the target audience for box office and record sales, breaking through and doing their own rebellious thing. The films were packed with rising stars of the day and spawned a series of rock and roll soundtracks. Icons such as Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Elvis Presley, and Little Richard all appeared on the big screen. A host of youth and rock films followed the success of Blackboard Jungle in 1956, whose use of We're Gonna Rock Around the Clock made a star of Bill Haley. So Rock Around the Clock really was a hit because of the movie. In addition, the use of rock music in soundtracks could trigger a record buying craze. Something that happened with the Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock was used over the credits at the beginning and talked about the social issues in the Blackboard Jungle. The song was released, but it was the film that provoked greater interest, and the song later then became a hit. So, in conclusion, that one iconic film influenced many others down the years and kicks off a pick of some of the best rock and roll soundtracks of the decade.
So, Mr. Mick, what can you relate about the Blackboard Jungle and early rock and roll?
Yeah, can't underestimate the influence of this one film. So, Blackboard Jungle, and there's no single film has matched the vinyl record buying frenzy that followed Blackboard Jungle and the clamor to own Bill Haley's single, Rock Around the Clock. A 10-year-old boy, Peter Ford, the son of actor Glenn Ford, played a curious role in the history of rock and roll. His father was due to appear in this teenage delinquency film, in fact, starred in it, which was set in an inner city high school. Peter Ford was obsessed with the B side to a Haley record called 13 Women and Only One Man in Town, a track about a nuclear bomb blast that leaves just 14 people alive. Ford, who was starring alongside a young Sidney Poitier, mentioned it to director Richard Brooks, and he decided to play Rock Around the Clock over the opening credits of the film. The rest is history. Though the soundtrack was not released as an album at the time, the other songs in the movie had real panache. Not only Haley's See You Later, Alligator and Rudy's Rock, but the Platters, The Great Pretender, and Only You. There were also songs by Freddie Bell and the Bell Boys and others. So it's a groundbreaking film. And what more could you want from a 50s rock film? And along those lines, there was a whole spate of movies that followed in that tradition because they saw this as a way to sell records and get people in the movie theaters. So there was Don't Knock the Rock. This film about rock being banned in a small town was certainly not to the case of New York Times reviewer back in 1956. He wrote, quote, most of the dialogue couldn't even be heard above the restless din. What is rock and roll? Well, to one comparatively middle-aged man who made the awful mistake of grabbing a seat down front, it goes thump, 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 thump. To most of the young viewers at the time, however, the soundtrack was exhilarating stuff, especially when Little Richard, who played himself in the movie, cut loose with Long Tall Sally and Tutti Frutti. Songs by the Platters, Ruth Brown, Jimmy Bowen, Nappy Brown, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, the Cadillacs, Bill Haley, and Allendale ensured its place among the best rock and roll soundtracks. Same year, Shake, Rattle, and Rock. In the mid 50s, Blues singer Big Joe Turner had star billing on the various rock and roll review tours that he joined. In 1956, he appeared in the film Shake, Rattle, and Rock, in which he shared the music with Fats Domino. The film, which played the teenage audience emotions with a plot about a pompous citizens committee that finds rock and roll threatening, starred a young Mike Connors, later Golden Globe winner of Mannix TV detective fame, and featured Domino on piano, playing three tremendous songs: I'm in Love Again, Honey Chili, and Ain't That a Shame. Then, of course, the same year, The Girl Can't Help It. What a great, interesting film that is. And so there was a former joke writer for the Marx Brothers made how to realize what an influence he had when he directed and produced The Girl Can't Help It, starring Jane Mansfield. The cameo performances of musicians Little Richard, Eddie Cochran, and Gene Vincent inadvertently created one of the most influential rock and roll soundtracks in history. The movie fascinated the 16-year-old John Lennon when he saw it in Liverpool. It showed the future Beatles star, for the first time, the rock stars he admitted he worshiped. The title song is by Little Richard. He also sings Ready Teddy and She's Got It. And the fine soundtrack also included Julie London singing Cry Me a River, Gene Vincent's Bebopalula, Blue Monday by Fats Domino, 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran, and songs by Johnny Olin, who was a minor rockabilly figure from the era. And there's a famous clip from the film that features that alluring Jane Mansfield and, of course, co-star Tom Owen. So the song's catchy melody and lyrics, which describe a woman's irresistible charm, has made it a classic of the genre. Ian Hunter, the lead singer of the British rock band Mott the Hoople, has often covered the song in his live performances, putting his own unique spin on the original. Hunter's version of The Girl Can't Help It is known for its energetic and playful delivery, with Hunter's distinctive vocals bringing a new level of excitement to the song. And if you want to know more about Ian Hunter, you can check out my book, On Track, Ian Hunter, because he recorded that and played it live. Then same year, Rock, 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 with an exclamation point. That was subtitled Alan Freed, the King of Rock and Roll. Though it's a rather weak film, which is not uncommon for the movies of the era, it's notable for being sprinkled with 21 performances by early rock and roll singers and groups. So there's Laverne Baker, Chuck Berry, Johnny Burnett Trio, Connie Francis, and we've got a number of people that really were breaking on the scene because of appearing in the movies, such as Frankie Lyman and the backing group The Teenagers. Song Why Do Fools Fall in Love was a memorable hit that year. 1959, there's Go Johnny Go, also with an exclamation point. So musical performances were also presented in a different way, and as a result, rock and roll films introduced a new genre of film. Gone were some of the stagey show dances. In their place came Chuck Berry and his famous duck walk, which was captured on film in Go Johnny Go. So rock and roll promoter Alan Freed holds a talent search to develop a new star, and he finds the elusive mystery contestant, Jimmy Clanton, who doesn't know he has won. So it's a groundbreaking film featuring a lot of music, and for a lot of young people, seeing it in the first time in the theater was something that they really enjoyed and started to buy records as a result of what they saw. So it's got the famous Chuck Berry duck walk in this film, and the only film appearance of Ritchie Valens, unfortunately, because he died that same year the movie was made, and that was in the plane crash that also killed Buddy Holly. Alan Freed gathered a galaxy of 50s rock and roll stars for the filming, and it's got one of the most memorable rock and roll soundtracks, all kinds of hits and all kinds of people that were breaking onto the scene at the time. 1957, there's Jamboree, and this is a pair of young singers who become overnight sensations. The film also features cameo performances and biggest performances of the era lip syncing to their recordings. Jerry Lee Lewis sings an alternative version of his original Sun Records hit, Great Balls of Fire. There's Carl Perkins, Slim Whitman, Frankie Avalon, Fats Domino, and of course, Count Basie gets in on the action. So we also have 1 O'Clock Jump featuring Joe Williams. So we got a little bit of jazz in that as well. In 1958, The Big Beat. That was a strange period for rock movies, as well as that was the same time as Jailhouse Rock. There were several calypso-based films and what was a boom time, and one of the calypso musicals starred, of all people, the writer Maya Angelou. When former Beatle Ringo Starr narrated the documentary Hollywood Rocks the Movies, the early years, there was a segment about another 57 film, Rock All Night, which featured the Platters. singing I'm Sorry, and also Fats Domino. We also got the Mills Brothers, the Del Vikings, the Diamonds, the Four Aces, and a little bit of the jazz with the Carl Jader Quintet. Then who can forget Hot Rod Gang in 1958? So
Yes.
singer-actor John Ashley had just starred in Frankenstein's Daughter when he landed the role of a hot rod driver who joined Gene Vincent's band so he can fund his drag racing ambition. So yeah, some of these plots are kind of off the wall, but fun at the same time. At the same time, Vincent had already become a star following his 1956 rockabilly hit Bebop-A-Lula, which was recorded with his Blue Caps. Vincent, who appears in the film, sings Dance in the Street, Baby Blue, Lovely Loretta, and Dance to the Bop on the soundtrack, and the soundtrack was released on Capitol Records. By the late 50s, the appeal of popular music was seeping into all sorts of film genres, even if they didn't feature bona fide rock and roll soundtracks. The Western movie Rio Bravo included music from rock star Ricky Nelson. Lots of rock stars from the 50s made film appearances, British singers such as Billy Fury and Tommy Steele. So, in conclusion, films helped to introduce early rockers to a broader audience and indeed even broke several artists as hit makers.
Yes, indeed. And thank you so much for sharing your music to the world. So, Mr. Mick, Don't Knock the Rock in 1956. Was not Elvis a huge music star as well as a being featured in film?
Indeed, Elvis always aspired to a film career, and his earliest films showed people his talent and recognized his ability to perform. So, in this case, you have to mention, of course, Jailhouse Rock, 1957. Though most of Elvis Presley's film work was done in the 60s, the real king of rock and roll made 5 films in the 50s, the best of which are arguably King Creole and Jailhouse Rock, as there actually is a decent plot and they're good movies. The latter movie offered Presley a role that loosely mirrored his own rise to fame, but via a character called Vince Everett, who spends time in prison and has a tempestuous relationship with Peggy's Judy Tyler. The film features superb Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller songs, resulting in one of the most memorable rock and roll soundtracks of the era, and includes probably the most famous of all Presley's musical movie numbers, the dazzling Jailhouse Rock dance sequence. The songs, featuring Scotty Moore on guitar and Bill Black on bass, include I Want to Be Free, Don't Leave Me Now, Young and Beautiful, and You're So Square, Baby I Don't Care. A song, of course, we talked about last week because that was recorded by the Beatles, and also others artists have recorded it, Joni Mitchell, Queen, and Brian Ferry. The King and His Wiggling Hips was censored on TV but allowed on film for Elvis to shine. He would tone down a bit after returning from the Army, but Presley began to be featured in movies. In short, there was no bigger rock movie star than Elvis Presley. The screen loved the King and his wiggling hips. He made 31 films between 1956 and 1971, and even though many of them were formulaic and forgettable, boy meets girl stories laced with hit songs, they were an absolute cash cow for the studios. Presley's films are estimated to have earned more than 2.62 billion US dollars. That's a lot of money. Of Presley's films, in all but one, he took the starring role. Some, such as Jailhouse Rock and King Creole, were good, but for Presley, his film career was the most frustrating part of his life. While on set, he was accompanied by numerous minders and rarely socialized with fellow actors, preferring to spend time alone practicing his karate. One of the publicists of Presley's 11 movies said, I got a lot of pressure from producers to get him to parties, but he never went. Some scenes embarrass him, serenading a freshly caught shrimp in Girls, 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 for example, and sometimes the unexpected strains of filming would ignite his temper, as when he threw a carton of milk at his own Rolls Royce after a long delay while he was waiting in an uncomfortable rubber wetsuit. However, the pressure to do more movies was constant because he made staggering amount of money doing it. While filming his last movie, Elvis on Tour, 1972, Presley told co-director making those old rock and roll movies made him physically ill. It was just that Hollywood's image of me was wrong, and I knew it and couldn't say anything about it. So he was recorded saying that in Rolling Stone magazine. Nevertheless, Presley was a powerful model for imitators. In Britain, his films and the success of U.S. jukebox musicals sparked movies featuring Tommy Steele, Cliff Richard, Adam Faith, and Billy Fury. In conclusion, Their dubious artistic value frustrated the singer himself, but the best, such as Jailhouse Rock, 1957, captured the magnetism of the young music star.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Elvis, thank you so much. Until now, you still echoing. So were the 1950s all about Elvis, Mr. Mac?
Not all about Presley, but there were adaptations of theater musicals or rock music vehicles. There had been a variety of excellent music based animated Disney movies, including The Lady and the Tramp and those brilliant Peggy Lee songs, Sleeping Beauty. The later 50s, though, other than Elvis, are tame by comparison. Thus, Presley's foray into the 1960s film scene made a great deal of financial sense. As Presley retreated from music, the time was right for the four mop tops to emerge from Liverpool because the films at this time were a little bit restrained and the Beatles really broke into the scene at a good time. So you had movies such as West Side Story, which was a little bit of rock, but not a whole lot. They were toned down quite a bit. There was also music, The Sound of Music, Oliver, and Funny Girl. And for those kind of films, more restrained than, of course, the Elvis Presley variety. In Oliver, consider yourself as a bit of a rock and roll feel, and it's a character Fagin and his gang of pickpockets. And now, also interesting about this is that this was an influence on popular culture and rock in particular. The Artful Dodger is the name of an album by acclaimed singer songwriter, once again, and my favorite artist, Ian Hunter, who wrote about this on my book, On Track, Ian Hunter. So some of those films were an influence for later rock artists. In conclusion, it's worth noting that these songs may have had a slightly more contemporary, upbeat feel, but they're still firmly rooted in the tradition of musical theater and not the same level of those early rock and roll classics or rock influence as some of the other musicals of the time.
So, Mr. Mac, did not the Beatles make a contribution to film music?
We pick up where we talked about them last week and last time, but yes, they did. And it was a perfect time for the Beatles to come on the scene because people were looking for something fresh and more rock oriented. But not the first, but they were original and obviously sold many records on their own. So it was good timing for the Beatles to break through the movie crowd with a rock oriented group. The Let It Be was not the first music film documentary, it was one of the most popular. But this genre has had its own distinguished history, ranging from fantastic concert films such as the band's The Last Waltz to the achingly beautiful documentary U2 Rattle and Hum. There have been numerous and momentous documentaries on Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, Bob Marley, Neil Young, Jimi Hendrix, Madonna, The Clash, Glenn Campbell, and Tom Petty, right up to Amy Winehouse in 2015. Some of them have, as Martin Scorsese in The Last Waltz and the Stone Roses documentary, Made of Stone, have been made by acclaimed directors who were not renowned for musical films. The Beatles set a new standard for rock and pop film musicals, and the format of their own first two films had been periodically updated in the half century since for movies such as Prince's Purple Rain, Spice Girls the movie. In the 21st century, Eminem's 8 Mile and 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Tryin' did for hip hop what the former movies did for Prince and Posh Spice and Company. The band's Last Waltz and U2 Rattle and Hum were responses to the impact that the Beatles had on film. One of the key changes in film musicals in the 1960s came via the Beatles, who provided a dreamlike version of the decade through their films. They also enjoyed incredible success with concurrently released soundtracks with the superb songs of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. In their first film, A Hard Day's Night, 1964, director Richard Lester cleverly captured the wit and charm of the four musicians in what was almost an early example of the extended pop video, as the Beatles explore the absurdity of their global fame as they travel to swinging 60s London. There was a similar anarchic freedom with Help, 1965, followed by the surreal and psychedelic Magical Mystery Tour, 1967, the animated comedy Yellow Submarine, 1968, and the 1970 documentary Let It Be with the famous improvised rooftop concert. There was bound to be a reaction to the Cliff Richard Clean Teen films from England, and it came when the Beatles starred making improvisational and imaginative rock and roll movies. Hard Day's Night, made at the peak of Beatlemania, captures the fun, excitement, and unforgettable music of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr as it portrays a frantic 36 hours in the lives of the rock group as they traveled to London from Liverpool. The spontaneity on camera was matched off film, as when Harrison, then 21, went up to 20-year-old bit part actress called Patty Boyd and said, "Will you marry me?" 2 years later, she became his first wife. I don't think it made such an impression on me at the time, but my sister and I did view the film as kids in Carteret, New Jersey. All of this came at the time of Beatlemania and Murray the K, and Cousin Brucey ruled AM radio from New York City at the time. Part of the charm was that the film captured the Beatles as individuals. The end soundtrack and result was a box office triumph as they revolutionized rock and roll movies, while the soundtrack album won a Grammy. Esteemed film critic Andrew Sarris hailed the movie as the Citizen Kane of jukebox musicals. Hollywood realized that it was a blueprint for making money and soon created a knockoff success with the Monkees. A Hard Day's Night inspired imitations at home too, including Jerry and the Pacemakers' Ferry Cross the Mersey. After the success of their first cinematic adventure, the Beatles decided to take control of their own films, and they turned to styles and modes of production more attuned to their musical sensibilities. Let It Be features that famous unplanned rooftop concert. It was freezing on the roof of Apple Studios, situated on London's Savile Row, on that day of filming in January 1969. And the only way the band could dampen the noise of the wind was to place women's pantyhose over the microphones as a shield. One Beatles movie that didn't come off, and one that promised to be the most anarchic of rock film, was playwright Joe Horton's proposed screenplay Up Against It, which was set to feature a film in which the Merseyside lads dressed as women. Despite Brian Epstein's initial enthusiasm, the project was dropped, and Horton was given just a kill fee for his script. In conclusion, the Beatles were instrumental in bridging the gap between pop and rock music, along with a visual film presentation for others to follow.
Yes, indeed. Beatles, again, thank you so much for being part in the music industry. So, Mr. Mick, what is the rock's world of rock movies?
Well, musicians have been playing versions of themselves on film since the early talkies, and cinema's long history of rock and roll movies ranges across studio features, including all those Elvis Presley movies, independent documentaries such as the band's 70s classic, The Last Waltz, and also avant garde, Sympathy for the Devil about the Rolling Stones. Rock's relationship with youth is inextricably bound up with its cinematic presentation. After the death of James Dean in September 1955, musicians filled a gap as the hero figures for teenagers. Blackboard Jungle, Rock Around the Clock, Frank Zappa later recalled his 15-year-old self jumping up and down in the cinema at this endorsement of the teenage cause. So a spate of 50s rock and roll movies followed all throughout that point of time, and the film musicals went through a tough time in the late 60s and early 70s, though some saw that there was a pot of money to be made. So, with those things in mind, the values that were changing at the time begin to be shown by the raucous period of the 1970s. In conclusion, after the early raucous periods, film seemed to calm down a bit, but in 1970s, that raucous returned.
Yes, definitely. So, who were the bad boys of rock that were rockers?
Well, the rock titans, the Rolling Stones, had their own cinema story. The Stones'
Yes.
musical and social significance attracted key avant garde and documentary filmmakers and made the controversial Sympathy for the Devil. Mick Jagger was a charismatic figure on screen, and talking about performance, those who were reviewing it, Roger Ebert said, "The surprise of the movie and the reason to see it is Mick Jagger's performance. It simply isn't good, it's a comment on his life and style." Another landmark entry in the history of rock and roll movies is Tommy, 1975, based on The Who's rock opera concept album from 6 years before. The surreal tale of a deaf, dumb, and blind kid who becomes first a pinball champion and then a messiah figure was outlandish and even had singing cameo from Jack Nicholson. The promotional expenses, more than $100,000 was allocated for parties and premieres, was extravagant. Looking back 20 years later, Pete Townsend of The Who told the LA Times, "During the Tommy film, director Ken Russell only slept for about 4 hours. I survived on cognac. I have no idea how he stayed awake. I simply behaved like an arrogant, half-drunk rock star I was at the time and entirely got my way." Elton John was already stupidly rich, arriving in a massive Rolls Royce like the Queen's and with his own number plate. Unlike feature films, many rock documentaries have been joyous celebrations of the music. Among the best are Bob Dylan's Don't Look Back, Monterey Pop, and Martin Scorsese, The Last Waltz. D.A. Pennebaker's 1973 documentary about the enigmatic David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust, and the Spiders from Mars doubles as a concert movie and an intimate look at a unique performer in full flight. Perry Henzel's The Harder They Come, a celebration of Jimmy Cliff's Jamaican music, was a cult hit at the 1972 Venice Film Festival. Some documentaries are more offbeat than others. Led Zeppelin's concert film, The Song Remains the Same, includes fantasy sequences such as Robert Plant as a knight rescuing a fair maiden. So some of these films were good, others were not successful for other bands, but even after their split, the Beatles continued to influence the shape of rock and roll movies. 1978 Bee Gees' vehicle, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, features the Gibb brothers along with Peter Frampton, Alice Cooper, Aerosmith, Earth, Wind and Fire, Donald Pleasance, and Steve Martin. For that film, of course, and others, they were an exuberant celebration, such as Rock and Roll High School 1979, capturing some of the enthusiasm as a young Beatles fan. But this, of course, was about the Ramones. And for the Ramones, they show up and join in the fun, leading to a memorable line: "Do your parents know your Ramones?" While the two main Ramones films in the song were remixed by Phil Spector for the soundtrack version, was also a cult feeling. All this great film that was very famous with the songs and the film was Grease. Biggest hit from Grease was undoubtedly "You're the One That I Want," which is a duet between John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John. The song was released and reached number one on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, stayed there for 2 weeks, and was one of the biggest hits of the year. That was filmed, of course, in Norwalk High School in Norwalk, California, was used as a filming location. The school's exterior and interior were meant to be a fictional 1950s high school. And I know that comes close to home because that high school in Norwalk was in the Suburban League, the same sports league that my alma mater, Mayfair High School in Lakewood, California, is in. One incident I remember playing at Norwalk was a hostile reception we got there while playing basketball in their gym for one of their games. I survived, though. I'm still here, so all is well. In
All
conclusion,
is well.
all is well. I'm still here. In conclusion, the 70s were a raucous and productive time for rock films.
Definitely all is well. And thank you, Rolling Stones, Elton John, for the music you share to the world. And until now, we are admiring it, right, Mr. Meg?
You bet.
What
Sure.
what music films were produced in the 1980s?
There were huge selling singles and soundtracks. Neil Diamond's The Jazz Singer and Richie Valens' biopic La Bamba with music by Los Lobos. So Richie Valens bursts across the screen in this celebrated music-filled movie with star-making performances by Lou Diamond Phillips. And certainly we have others to mention: the Blues Brothers, the Commitments. And from the Blues Brothers film, we have, of course, Soul Man, which was a 1967 song written and composed by Isaac Hayes and David Porter, first successful as a number 2 hit single by Atlantic Records and the soul duo Sam and Dave. And then the Blues Brothers performed the song. They also had a hit with it, and of course, in the movie. So there are a number of films through the 1980s that are highlights. So in conclusion, there's a few highlights from those films that were released in the 1980s.
Yes. So, what are the notable films should be mentioned?
Yeah, there's a few other mentioned, though the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and few films later were the golden age of rock movies. Each decade has a contribution to the genre, including Prince's Oscar-winning Purple Rain, 1984, and rapper Eminem's turn as hip-hop hopeful in, of course, his film, which was that 8 Mile and then building rap battle that you can see in that film. So, in conclusion, the genre matured on screen with movies like Purple Rain, Eminem's film, while you also had the Rocky Horror Picture Show and Pink Floyd The Wall wove rock's experimental edge into surreal storytelling and social commentary.
Yes. So, to wrap up the discussion, Mr. Meg, how can we conclude?
So rock and roll emerged in the mid 20th century as a rebellious fusion of rhythm and blues, country and gospel, igniting a cultural revolution that reshaped music and society. Pioneers like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Elvis Presley brought raw energy and charisma to the stage in the 1950s. The genre evolved through the 1960s and 70s with bands like the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and Led Zeppelin. And parallel to the rise, rock and roll found its vivid counterpart in film. So we had films like Rock Around the Clock, Jailhouse Rock, which showcased the genre stars and electrifying appeal. And the 70s and 80s, Rocky Horror Picture Show and The Wall, which were social commentary and surreal. So the history of rock and roll and its cinematic legacy are inseparable threads in a tapestry of rebellion, creativity, and raw expression. From jukeboxes to multiplexes, the genre transcended its roots to become a global force, with film serving as both a mirror and megaphone for its evolution. Whether it's the primal energy of Elvis shaking up the 1950s or the haunting visuals of The Wall dissecting alienation, rock and its movies remain a testament to music's power to provoke, inspire, and endure. In conclusion, as we look back, it's clear rock and roll didn't just change the sound, it changed the story.
Yes, indeed. And again, thank you so much for your contribution to the world. As Mr. Mick saying, screen shakers and rock and roll films have long been a powerful force in cinema, capturing the rebellious energy, raw emotion, and electrifying spirit of rock music. So, Mr. Mick, would you like to plug in something?
If you would mind, of course, the Doctor of Digital podcast and a couple books out there, Burning America and On Track Ian Hunter. You can also catch me on Facebook, the Idea to Author Coach, if you want to write books and sell more books. Let's have a conversation. Till next time, Deus Volt.
Yes, people, I want to plug in our newest baby podcast, Mental Health 101, and its first season, people, first season, with, of course, Mr. May, the Dr. Digital. So please do listen, Mental Health 101, wherever you listen your podcast. So, Mr. Mick, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Good to see you, my friend.
More to come, people. See you soon.